A millionaire walks distracted in the park with his 2-year-old son while talking on the phone about business, leaving the nanny to take care of the child. Suddenly, a 6-year-old beggar girl approaches and whispers something that makes his blood run cold. "Sir, I saw your son last night in the most dangerous alley in the city." He laughs, saying it's impossible since he left his son at home with the nanny. But when the girl describes the exact color of the pajamas the boy was wearing, the millionaire turns pale. And what happens in the next few seconds makes a whirlwind of thoughts race through his mind. The afternoon sun gilded the leaves of Central Park as Edward Miles pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes lost in the numbers dancing across the screen. Millions in pending deals, contracts awaiting his signature, decisions that could alter the fate of entire companies. At 42, he had built a financial empire few dared to dream of. But at that moment, as he absent-mindedly pushed the stroller where his son Gabriel dozed, his mind was entirely consumed by third-quarter earnings. "I need those reports by morning, Sandra. No excuses this time," he muttered into the device, not noticing the stroller had rolled to a stop. His hands gestured in the air as if the person on the other end could see him, his voice rising to the authoritative tone his employees knew all too well. Marissa, the nanny he had hired 3 months ago, approached silently and took hold of the stroller with a gentle hand. She was a woman in her early 30s, always impeccably dressed, with a maternal smile that had won Edward over from the first interview. Her references were perfect, her experience unquestionable, and Gabriel seemed to adore her. Everything a busy father could wish for. "Shall I take Gabriel to the sandbox while you finish your call, Mr. Miles?" she suggested in a soft voice, already unbuckling the child's safety harness. Edward gave a distracted nod, his attention snapping back to the figures his assistant was reading from the other end of the line. 2 million here, 3 million there. Each number represented hours of work, meticulously planned strategies, victories won in boardrooms where only the strong survived. It was then that a small shadow drew near. A girl of about 6, with worn clothes and tangled hair, watched him with eyes far too serious for her age. She waited patiently for him to finish talking about growth percentages before taking another step in his direction. Edward noticed the child and made an impatient gesture with his hand, signaling for her to move along. He didn't have time for panhandlers, especially not when he was closing the biggest deal of the month. But the girl didn't move. Instead, she came closer, her expression carrying a disturbing gravity. "Mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant city traffic, "I saw your son last night in Perdition's Alley." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He slowly lowered the phone, his eyes locking onto the girl's dirt-smudged face. For a moment, the world around him seemed to stop. The sounds of the park, the voice on the phone, it all faded into a distant hum. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice coming out hoarse. The girl glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "Your baby was there, mister. In the alley, I saw him." A nervous laugh escaped Edward's lips. This was impossible. Absurd. Gabriel had spent the previous night at home, sleeping in his crib under Marissa's care while he attended a business dinner that ran late. The child was safe, protected, far from any danger. "You must have him confused with someone else, little one," he said, trying to sound kind. But his voice betrayed a rising irritation. "My son was home all night." The girl's eyes narrowed, and she took another step forward. "He was wearing orange pajamas. Mister, I saw them." Her voice carried a certainty that made the blood in Edward's veins run cold. The world collapsed around him in that instant. The orange pajamas. Those 3 words echoed in Edward's mind like a hammer striking an anvil. His legs trembled slightly as he knelt to the girl's level, the phone forgotten in his right hand, still broadcasting his assistant's irritated voice. "How do you know about the pajamas?" he asked, his voice a tense whisper. The child watched him with those large, serious eyes, as if she carried secrets too heavy for her fragile age. "I live on the street, mister. I see a lot of things nobody else does," she answered, glancing quickly over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching. "Your baby was crying." The lady with him seemed nervous. Edward felt the world spin. The orange pajamas were a pair he had bought just 2 days earlier from an exclusive children's boutique on Madison Avenue. They were unique, with a pattern of tiny hand-embroidered giraffes that had caught his eye during a rare break between meetings. Gabriel had worn them for the first time the night before, when Edward had put him to bed before leaving for his business engagement. There was no way a homeless child could know that specific detail. It was impossible, unless... "Edward? Edward, are you listening to me?" Sandra's shrill voice echoed from the phone, pulling him back to the brutal reality of the moment. He ended the call abruptly, shoving the device into his pocket with trembling hands. His eyes searched desperately for Marissa and Gabriel, who should have been playing in the sandbox a few yards away. When he finally located them, a tightness gripped his chest, nearly stealing his breath. Marissa was watching their conversation from a distance, her eyes fixed on him and the girl with a disturbing intensity. It wasn't the concerned look of a diligent nanny checking if her employer was okay. It was something else, calculating, almost predatory. When she realized Edward had noticed her, she forced a smile and waved, but she couldn't completely hide the tension in her features. "And the lady's coming over," the girl whispered, her small body visibly tensing with fear. "I have to go, mister. She doesn't like it when I talk to you." Before Edward could ask another question, Marissa approached quickly, holding Gabriel on one hip and extending her free hand toward the street girl. Her fingers closed around the child's thin wrist with a force that seemed excessive for the situation. "Hello, sweetie. Are you bothering Mr. Miles?" Marissa said, her voice maintaining its usual sweet tone, but her eyes radiated a coldness Edward had never seen before. "Kids your age should be in school, not asking for money in the park." The girl tried to pull away from her grip, her eyes filling with tears she fought to hold back. "I wasn't asking for anything, Mom. I was just talking." "Of course you were," Marissa replied, tightening her grip on the child's wrist. "Mr. Miles is a very busy man. He doesn't have time for made-up stories." Her eyes met Edward's, and he saw something there that made him question everything he thought he knew about this woman. "Do you need any help, Mr. Miles?" Marissa asked, but the tone of her voice sounded more like a veiled threat than a genuine offer of assistance. Gabriel began to whimper in her arms, as if sensing the tension in the air. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The girl seized a moment of Marissa's distraction to wrench free from her grasp and bolt toward the bushes at the edge of the park, disappearing into the foliage like a frightened shadow. Marissa watched her escape with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "These street kids will make up any story to get $1, she commented casually, adjusting Gabriel in her arms. "You shouldn't pay them any mind." But Edward couldn't shake the certainty in that little girl's voice, nor the genuine fear in her eyes when Marissa had approached. On the entire drive back home, Edward watched Marissa in the rearview mirror. She was humming softly to Gabriel, who had fallen asleep in the back seat, but her eyes seemed too alert, as if analyzing every movement, every unspoken word. The silence in the car was thick, heavy with questions he didn't know how to ask without revealing his growing suspicions. Edward's mansion stood imposing at the end of the tree-lined cul-de-sac, its large windows reflecting the last rays of the afternoon sun. 40 rooms, a state-of-the-art security system, cameras on every external angle, a fortress he had built to protect his family, but which now seemed vulnerable in a way he had never considered, from an enemy who might be living inside it. "Marissa," he said casually as he parked in the garage, "how was last night? Did Gabriel sleep well?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, a nearly imperceptible pause that did not escape Edward's heightened senses. He slept like an angel. Mr. Miles fell asleep right after dinner and didn't wake up until this morning. What time did he go down exactly? Edward pressed, pretending to check messages on his phone while watching her reactions in the reflection. Around 8 o'clock, Marissa replied, her voice maintaining its professional tone, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she unbuckled Gabriel's car seat. We did bath time. He had his bottle and went straight to his crib. Didn't even cry during the night. Edward knew that was a lie. Gabriel was still adjusting to his new room and usually woke up at least twice during the night, crying until someone soothed him. It was impossible for him to have slept through the night without interruption. And you stayed home the whole time? The question came out with more intensity than he intended, causing Marissa to look up suddenly. Of course, Mr. Miles. Where else would I be? There was a defensiveness in her voice now, a rigidity in her shoulders that contrasted with her usually relaxed posture. You left very clear instructions about not leaving the house with Gabriel at night. Instructions that, Edward realized with growing horror, could have been broken without him ever knowing. The security cameras only covered the property's exterior, not the rooms inside, a decision he had made to preserve the family's privacy, but which now revealed itself as a critical flaw in his defenses. Inside the house, Edward watched Marissa go through her usual routine with Gabriel. She fed him, played with him, sang the lullabies that always worked. Everything seemed normal. But there was a theatricality to her gestures he hadn't noticed before, as if she were playing the part of the perfect nanny for an unseen audience. "Marissa," he said, trying to sound casual as he shuffled through documents on his desk, "do you know a place called Perdition's Alley?" The question caught her off guard. She nearly dropped the bottle she was preparing, her fingers clenching around the glass with enough force to turn her knuckles white. "Never heard of it." "Mr. Miles, is it somewhere in the city?" Her reply came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Edward lied, but he kept watching. "A child in the park mentioned the name. I thought you might know it." Marissa's face contorted into an expression she tried to mask quickly, but not before Edward caught a flash of what looked like panic. "Homeless kids say a lot of nonsense, Mr. Miles. You shouldn't listen to them." It was the second time that day she had mentioned street kids making up stories, and the coincidence did not go unnoticed. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized Marissa had strategically positioned herself between him and Gabriel, who was playing on the rug with his colorful toys. "I have a few engagements tonight," Edward announced, deciding to test a dangerous theory. "You'll be with Gabriel again." "Of course, Mr. Miles. You can rest easy." But there was something in her smile that didn't match her reassuring words. A poorly concealed anxiety, an anticipation that made Edward's stomach clench with fear. That night, he would pretend to leave, but he would remain hidden, watching. He had to find out the truth, even if it was more terrible than his mind could imagine. At 8 o'clock, Edward staged his exit with theatrical precision. He put on a dark suit, grabbed his car keys, and kissed Gabriel on the forehead, whispering, "A daddy will be back soon." That sounded more like a desperate promise than a casual farewell. Marissa watched from the living room doorway, her eyes following his every move with an attention that seemed excessive. "Don't worry about a thing, Mr. Miles. Gabriel will be safe with me," she said, her words carrying a double meaning that made Edward wonder if he was imagining threats where none existed. He drove to the end of the street, parked on a dark side road, and returned on foot, using the side entrance to the property that led to the backyard garden. Years of strategic meetings had taught Edward patience, but never had the wait been as agonizing as this. Hidden among the rose bushes his ex-wife had planted, watching his own home like an intruder. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Marissa gave Gabriel a bath, fed him, and put him in his crib. She turned on the television and settled onto the sofa, apparently relaxed. Edward started to feel ridiculous. wondering if his paranoia was turning a dedicated nanny into a phantom threat created by his stressed mind. But then, around 10 o'clock, Marissa did something that froze the blood in his veins. She stood up silently, checked that Gabriel was asleep, and went to the kitchen, where she picked up the cell phone she had left on the counter. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing a message Edward couldn't see from his position in the garden. Minutes later, she returned to Gabriel's room. Edward saw her lean over the crib for what felt like an eternity, her movements deliberate and cautious. When she straightened up, she was carrying Gabriel in her arms, wrapped in a blanket that completely concealed his clothes. Edward's heart pounded so hard he feared the sound might give him away. His breathing became ragged, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he watched Marissa head for the back door of the house, the same one he had used to enter the garden. She slipped out silently, looking around with the caution of someone committing a crime. Gabriel seemed to be sleeping deeply, his small body limp in her arms. Marissa walked quickly through the garden, heading for a side gate that was rarely used. Edward followed her at a safe distance, each step a torture of indecision. Should he confront her immediately, call the police, or keep following to find out where she was taking his son? His paternal instinct screamed for him to act, but his rational mind argued that he needed evidence, answers he would only get if he kept watching. Marissa walked for 3 blocks until she reached a dark van parked under a tree, away from the streetlights. Edward recognized the vehicle. It was the same one he had seen parked across from his house a few times in recent weeks, always with someone in the driver's seat who seemed to be waiting. A man got out of the van, tall and lean, dressed in dark clothes. Edward couldn't see his face from a distance, but he noticed Marissa greet him with familiarity. They spoke in whispers for a few minutes, and then Marissa handed Gabriel to the man. Edward felt his world shatter as he watched his son disappear inside the van. His legs nearly gave out, but he forced himself to keep watching, mentally recording every detail: the license plate, the man's appearance, the direction they took. The van pulled away slowly, not turning on its headlights until it was far from the neighborhood. Marissa stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, checking her phone before returning the way she came. Edward followed her back, reaching the garden just moments before she did. When Marissa entered through the back door, he could see her through the kitchen window, quickly washing her hands and checking her hair in the window's reflection, as if trying to erase any evidence of what she had just done. She went upstairs and into Gabriel's room. Even from a distance, Edward could hear when she started to cry loudly, a theatrical sound that echoed through the silent house. Edward remained hidden in the garden, his body trembling not just from the night's chill, but from the horror of what he had just witnessed. Marissa's theatrical cries echoed through the house, a calculated sound that made bile rise in his throat. How had he been so blind? How had he not realized he was entrusting his son to a criminal? 15 minutes later, the crying stopped abruptly. Edward saw Marissa come downstairs, pick up the landline phone in the living room, and dial a number with seemingly trembling fingers. Her performance was just beginning. Mr. Miles, something terrible has happened. Her voice came out in broken sobs, filled with a distress that could convince any unsuspecting person. Gabriel, he's not in his crib. I don't know what happened. Edward felt a primal rage consume him. Every word from that woman was a stab at his trust, at his ability to protect his own son. He forced himself to remain calm, knowing he had to play her game until he uncovered everyone involved. "Calm down, Marissa," he said into the phone, faking the panic any father would feel in that situation. "Have you checked the whole house? Maybe he learned to climb out of the crib. I've looked everywhere, Mr. Miles. The doors are locked, the windows too. It's like he just vanished." Marissa took a dramatic pause, and Edward could hear her sniffling as if crying, "You'd need to come back immediately. Maybe we should call the police." "I'm on my way," Edward replied, hanging up with hands that shook with restrained outrage. He ran to where he had left his car, drove a few blocks to create the illusion that he was returning from afar, and came back to the mansion, making enough noise to announce his arrival. Marissa was waiting for him at the door, her eyes red and her clothes slightly disheveled to complete the act. "Mr. Miles, I'm so sorry. I was watching television, and when I went to check on Gabriel at 10:30, he wasn't in his crib." Her words came out in a rush, but Edward noted she had rehearsed this version of the story, adjusting the times to create a convincing narrative. He ran upstairs to Gabriel's room, Marissa close behind, her hands touching his arm, in gestures that seemed comforting but which Edward now interpreted as attempts at manipulation. The crib was empty, the sheets purposefully mussed to simulate a child having been there recently. "We're calling the police. Now," Edward declared, watching Marissa's reaction closely. For a fraction of a second, he saw genuine panic flash across her face before she recomposed her mask of concern. "Of course, Mr. Miles. It's the right thing to do." Her voice sounded too controlled for someone who should have been in despair. "They'll want to ask a lot of questions. They'll investigate everything." Edward caught the subtle threat in her words. Marissa was testing his reactions, trying to figure out how much he knew. "What kind of questions?" he asked, feigning naivety. "About the house's security, about people who have access, about me." "Two." Marissa watched him carefully, like a predator sizing up its prey. "They always suspect the people closest first. It's standard protocol." "Do you have something to hide, Marissa?" The question came out harsher than Edward intended, but he wanted to see how she would react under pressure. Marissa stared at him with eyes that seemed wounded by the suggestion. "How could you think that? I love Gabriel as if he were my own son. I would never do anything to hurt him." Her hands clenched into fists, a gesture that could be interpreted as indignation, but which Edward now saw as a struggle to contain her nervousness. The phone rang, cutting through the tension. Edward answered, and a distorted voice on the other end made his blood run cold. "If you want to see your son again, don't call the police. Wait for instructions." The call ended abruptly. Marissa watched Edward's pale face and asked with false innocence, "Who was it, Mr. Miles? Any news about Gabriel?" Edward studied her for a moment that felt like an eternity, realizing she already knew exactly who had called. The hours that followed were a hell of silent tension. Edward pretended to follow the kidnappers' instructions while his mind worked feverishly to find a way to get Gabriel back without risking his son's life. Marissa remained by his side like a worried shadow, offering tea, suggesting he rest, playing the part of the dedicated employee with a perfection that now disgusted him. "Mr. Miles, you should try to get some sleep," she whispered for the third time that night, her hand touching his shoulder with false tenderness. "When the kidnappers call again, you'll need to have a clear head to negotiate." Edward stared at her, noticing how she seemed to know exactly what the criminals would do next. "How do you know they'll call again, Marissa? They might have taken Gabriel for good." A shadow of irritation crossed her face before she recomposed her expression of concern. "That's what always happens in the movies, Mr. Miles. They always ask for money, don't they?" "This isn't a movie, Marissa. This is my son." Edward watched her closely as she processed his words, noting how her eyes darted, as if calculating her responses. At 6 in the morning, Edward announced he had to leave to handle some banking matters, preparing for a potential ransom demand. Marissa offered to accompany him, but he firmly refused, claiming she should stay home in case the kidnappers called. Instead of going to the bank, Edward drove straight to the office of Robert Silver, a private investigator he had used a few times to run background checks on employees. Rob was an ex-cop, with connections in places Edward had never imagined needing to explore. "I need you to investigate this woman," Edward said, handing over a photo of Marissa he had taken from the hiring files. "I want to know everything about her. Everything. And I need the information today." Rob studied the photo with experienced eyes. "Nanny trouble. It's more common than you think, Ed. People take advantage of wealthy families, trust, "It's more serious than you think," Edward replied, his voice laced with an urgency that made Rob sit up straight. "My son disappeared last night, and I have reason to believe she's involved." For the next 3 hours, Rob worked with the efficiency of someone who knew the back channels of the information underworld. Calls were made, contacts activated, favors called in. Edward remained in the office, drinking cold coffee and pacing like a caged animal. "Ed, you need to see this," Rob said finally, returning to the room with a grim expression. "Marissa Carter doesn't exist. At least, not the Marissa Carter you hired." The investigator spread documents across the desk, like cards in a deadly game. "The identity is a fake. The references she provided are for people who don't exist, or for fictional addresses. I managed to trace a few leads and found out her real name is Lucy Sanchez." Edward felt his legs weaken. "Go on." "Lucy Sanchez has an interesting history. 3 priors for fraud, 2 for criminal conspiracy. Even more interesting, she owes $300,000 to a loan shark known as the Shark, a man who doesn't take kindly to late payments." Rob pointed to a blurry photo taken from a security camera. "She's been seen several times in the last 2 months, talking to this man here, Carlos Montenegro, a specialist in kidnapping children from wealthy families. The police have been after him for 3 years. Edward studied the photo, immediately recognizing the lean man he had seen in the van the night before. "They planned this from the beginning," he muttered, more to himself than to Rob. "There's more," the investigator continued. "Montenegro is linked to a network of criminals who specialize in infiltrating staff into wealthy homes. They study routines, weak points, and then execute near-perfect kidnappings." Edward's phone rang, making both men jump. It was Marissa, her voice filled with a feigned urgency that now sounded grotesque to his ears. "Mr. Miles, the kidnappers called. They want $2 million by noon tomorrow. They said if you call the police, you'll never see Gabriel again." She took a theatrical pause. "Mr. Miles, are you okay? Your voice sounds strange." "I'm on my way home," Edward replied, hanging up quickly. Rob watched him with concern. "What are you going to do now?" Edward gathered the documents from the table, folding them carefully before tucking them into his inner jacket pocket. "I'm going to save my son. And I'm going to make this woman pay for every second of suffering she's caused me." Edward returned home with a plan forming in his mind. But everything changed when he found a white envelope slipped under the front door. His hands trembled as he opened it, immediately recognizing the elegant handwriting he had seen on hundreds of documents during his turbulent marriage. "If you want to see Gabriel alive, come alone to the Grand Central Cafe at 3 p.m. Don't bring anyone, don't tell anyone, especially not the police or your private investigators. Yes, I know about Robert Silver. Helen, his ex-wife, Gabriel's mother." Edward felt the world spin as the implications of the message crystallized in his mind. Helen was involved in the kidnapping of her own son. The woman he had loved, with whom he had built a family, was part of a plan to destroy him using the child they had both created. Marissa appeared at the living room door just then, watching him with eyes feigning concern. "Mr. Miles, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Edward quickly folded the note, hiding it in his pocket. "I'm just worried about Gabriel," he lied, but his voice came out hoarser than he intended. "Of course, that's natural," Marissa replied, but there was something different in her tone now, a subtle confidence, as if she knew she had the upper hand. "The kidnappers said they would call again at 5 to confirm the payment details." Edward studied her, realizing she knew about the meeting with Helen. Everything was coordinated, every move calculated. He wasn't just dealing with a criminal nanny and a kidnapping ring. He was facing a conspiracy orchestrated by Gabriel's own mother. At 3 o'clock sharp, Edward walked into the Grand Central Cafe, a place he and Helen used to frequent when they were still married. The irony was not lost on him. Helen was sitting at a table in the back. wearing sunglasses and a hat that partially hid her face. But he would have recognized her anywhere. "You came," she said as he approached, her voice a mix of satisfaction and something that might have been remorse. "Where is my son, Helen?" Edward sat in the opposite chair, fighting to keep his voice low despite the rage boiling in his chest. "Our son," she corrected coldly. "De Gabriel is my son too, Edward. Something you seem to have forgotten when you decided to cut me out of his life completely after the divorce." Edward clenched his fists under the table. "You lost custody because you abandoned Gabriel for 3 months to travel through Europe with your lover. The judge made his decision based on facts. The judge made his decision based on the expensive lawyers you could afford, and I couldn't," Helen retorted, removing her sunglasses so he could see the bitterness in her eyes. "You used your money to destroy me in court, Edward. Now I'm using other resources to get back what's mine." "Gabriel isn't property, Helen. He's an innocent child who must be terrified, not understanding why he isn't home with people who love him." Helen laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the nearly empty cafe. "People who love him. Like you, who spends 18 hours a day at work and barely knows his own son's favorite songs. Or like Marissa, whom you hired without properly checking her background." A chill ran down Edward's spine. "How do you know about Marissa?" "I recommended her to you, Edward. Not directly, of course, but I created the circumstances for you to find each other. The nanny agency where you found her received a very convincing recommendation for Marissa Carter." Helen smiled cruelly. "You've always been so predictable, so confident in your ability to control everything around you." Edward realized he had fallen into a trap that had been planned for months. "You orchestrated everything, hiring Marissa, the access to my house, the kidnapping." "I orchestrated a plan to get my son back," Helen interrupted. "Marissa had her own financial motivations. Carlos Montenegro and his crew have their specialties. I just coordinated the available resources. And Gabriel, what happens to him when you get what you want?" Helen hesitated for a moment, and Edward saw a crack in her cold facade. "Gabriel will be with me, away from you, away from this life of emotional neglect you offer. We'll go to another country where we'll start a new life." "You're insane if you think I'll allow that." Helen leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You don't have a choice, Edward. Pay the $2 million, sign the custody transfer papers my lawyers have prepared, and Gabriel will live a happy life with me. Refuse and—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. Edward felt his world completely crumble as he realized the woman before him was no longer the Helen he had known, but a stranger consumed by revenge and capable of anything to get what she wanted. Edward left the cafe, with Helen's words echoing in his mind like a relentless hammer. Every step back to the car was a fight against the brutal reality he had just uncovered. He wasn't just facing criminals driven by greed, but a woman he had known intimately, had loved, and who was now willing to use their own son as a weapon in a private war. During the drive home, his thoughts turned to Gabriel's 2 years of life. How many important moments had he missed because he was stuck in endless meetings? How many times had he chosen to close a deal instead of reading a bedtime story? Helen was right about his neglect, and that truth hurt more than any financial blackmail. Marissa was waiting for him in the living room, looking anxious. "How was the meeting at the bank, Mr. Miles? Did you manage to sort out the money issue?" Edward looked at her with new eyes, seeing not just the criminal nanny he had discovered, but a pawn in Helen's cruel game. "It's all being arranged," he lied, sinking into the armchair where he used to review contracts, but which now felt like an empty throne in a crumbling kingdom. "That's good," Marissa replied, but Edward noticed she was nervous, constantly checking the clock. "You look tired. Maybe you should rest a bit before the kidnapper's next call." "Marissa," Edward said suddenly, making her jump, "do you have children?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable underneath. No, Mr. Miles. Why do you ask? Just curious. He lied again, but he continued to watch her. It must be hard taking care of other people's children when you have debts to pay, especially debts to dangerous people. Marissa turned visibly pale. I don't know what you're talking about. $300,000 is a lot of money, Lucy. The use of her real name made Marissa take a step back, her eyes wide with panic. How did you find out? It's not hard to discover the truth when you have the right resources. Edward stood up slowly, keeping his voice calm despite the storm in his chest. The question is, do you really want to do this? Destroy an innocent child's life to save your own skin? Lucy began to tremble. You don't understand. They'll kill me if I don't do what I promised. The shark doesn't forgive debts. And you thought kidnapping my son was the solution. I didn't want to. The words came out in a desperate cry that echoed through the empty house. I just needed a job, money to pay what I owe. When your ex-wife approached me with this proposal, it seemed like the only way out. Edward felt a pang of something that might have been compassion, but the image of Gabriel in the hands of strangers quickly smothered it. Helen approached you. How? She knew about my debts, about my situation. She said she'd pay me $500,000 if I could get access to your son and follow her instructions. Lucy sank onto the sofa, the weight of her confession seeming to crush her shoulders. I thought it would just be photographs, information about the house's routine. I didn't know they were actually going to take Gabriel. But you took my son to those men last night. Genuine tears began to stream down Lucy's face. They said it was just to scare you, to make sure you'd pay the ransom. They promised Gabriel wouldn't be hurt. Edward sat on the edge of the coffee table, keeping his distance but studying every expression on her face. Where is my son now, Lucy? I don't know exactly. Carlos never told me the location, just that Gabriel was safe and would be returned as soon as it was all over. She looked up, her eyes pleading. Mr. Miles, I swear I didn't want it to come to this. When I saw how much you love Gabriel, how he's such a happy child, I regretted it. But you did nothing to stop it. I couldn't. They have pictures of me handing Gabriel over. Recordings of our conversations. If I betray them, I'll go to prison, and the shark will still kill me. Lucy sobbed. I'm trapped, Mr. Miles. There's no way out for me. Edward processed the information, his analytical mind working even in the midst of the emotional chaos. What if there was a way out? What if I could protect you from the shark and make sure you don't go to prison? Lucy stared at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. In exchange for what? In exchange for you helping me get my son back. The silence that followed was thick, charged with possibilities and dangers. Lucy wiped her face with the backs of her hands, her breathing still ragged. How? You know their routine, you know how they communicate, you have access to their contacts. You can pretend you're still following the plan while you're actually helping me find Gabriel. Edward leaned forward. But I need to know right now. Are you with them? Or are you with me? Lucy closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, there was a determination that hadn't been there before. I'm with Gabriel. That child doesn't deserve to go through this because of the mistakes of adults. Edward felt the first flicker of hope in hours, but he knew the game had just begun. Trusting Lucy was a calculated risk that could cost Gabriel his life. But Edward knew he needed someone on the inside. For the next 2 hours, they worked together, creating a plan that hinged on perfect timing and considerable luck. Carlos will call at 5 to confirm the payment details, Lucy explained, her hands still trembling slightly. He always uses burner phones, so tracing the call will be impossible. But I know how he thinks. I know his patterns. Edward took notes on a pad, his business mind finally finding a productive focus for the first time since the nightmare began. What kind of patterns? He never keeps the kids in the same place for more than 24 hours. He's paranoid about location, but he has one rule: He always chooses abandoned places with multiple escape routes. Lucy paused, biting her lip nervously. There are 3 places he uses regularly in the city: a warehouse in the industrial district, an abandoned house in the North End, and a depot near the docks. How do you know this? Because he showed me photos of the places when he was explaining the plan. Said I needed to know the facilities where Gabriel would be held. Her voice was laced with disgust. He wanted me to know that my product would be well cared for. Edward felt a surge of rage at hearing his son referred to as a product, but he forced himself to stay focused. And Helen? Will she be there during the exchange? I don't know. Carlos never mentioned details about her beyond the initial payment he received. Lucy hesitated. But I can try to find out during the 5 o'clock call. When the phone rang promptly at 5, Edward watched Lucy answer with a performance that rivaled professional actors. Her voice was controlled, businesslike, with no trace of the despair she had shown hours earlier. Carlos? Yes, everything's fine here. Mr. Miles has the money. She glanced at Edward, who nodded, confirming their rehearsed script. He wants proof that Gabriel is okay before he makes any transfer. Edward could hear Carlos's rough voice on the other end, but couldn't make out the words. Lucy asked several seemingly innocent questions that Edward recognized as attempts to extract information about the location. I understand. And how much time do we have to arrange the drop? A pause. A noon tomorrow is too short, Carlos. The bank needs at least another longer pause. Right, 2 p.m. Then, and the location. Edward leaned forward, every muscle tense as he waited for the answer that could determine his son's fate. The depot near Pier 47. Yes, I know where that is. Lucy quickly scribbled on a piece of paper, just Mr. Miles, as agreed. He comes alone with the money, you hand over Gabriel. And everyone goes on with their lives. When she hung up, Edward saw that her hands were shaking again. Well, Gabriel is in the warehouse in the industrial district. Carlos was bragging about how well-behaved the boy is. Lucy took a deep breath. But the exchange is at the depot by the docks tomorrow at 2. It's a trap, Mr. Miles. They're not going to return Gabriel. How do you know? Because Carlos laughed when I mentioned everyone going on with their lives. It was a laugh I've heard before. It's the one he uses when he knows someone isn't going to survive to tell the tale. Edward felt a cold dread wash over him. They plan to kill me during the exchange. And probably me too, once they don't need my services anymore. Lucy stood up, pacing nervously to the window. Helen may not know this, but Carlos doesn't leave loose ends. Then we have to act before the exchange. Tonight. Lucy turned to face him. The warehouse is guarded. Carlos always leaves at least 2 men on watch, and they're armed. Edward thought for a moment, recalling the lessons he'd learned building his corporate empire. When you can't win with force, you win with strategy. What if we created a diversion? Something that would make them leave the site temporarily? What kind of diversion? The kind only a wealthy man with connections can create. Edward picked up the phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. Rob? It's me again. I need another favor, a big one. As he explained his plan to the investigator, Edward saw genuine hope in Lucy's face for the first time. It was risky, dependent on many variables. But it was better than passively waiting for an exchange that would result in 2 deaths and Gabriel remaining a captive. Do you think it will work? Lucy asked when he finished the call. Edward looked out the window at the garden where Gabriel used to play, his determination solidifying like tempered steel. It has to, because I'm not losing my son to Helen's revenge or Carlos's greed, no matter the cost. The night would be long, and tomorrow would determine if Edward was truly the man he thought he was when everything was on the line. At 10 o'clock that night, Edward and Rob met in a deserted parking lot 3 blocks from the industrial district. The investigator had brought 2 of his most trusted men, ex-cops who now worked in private security and knew the unwritten rules of delicate operations. I have to admit, Ed, this is the riskiest plan I've ever agreed to, Rob said. and checking their communication gear for the third time. If anything goes wrong, we're dealing with armed criminals who won't hesitate to use violence. Edward adjusted the bulletproof vest Rob had insisted he wear. The gear was uncomfortable, heavy, a physical reminder of how far his life had deviated from corporate normalcy. Gabriel is 2. Rob, he must be terrified, not understanding why he's not home. I can't let him spend another night in their hands. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Lucy executed her part of the plan with surgical precision. She had called Carlos, feigning panic as she reported that Edward was acting strangely, asking questions about Gabriel that suggested he was growing suspicious. "He's onto something, Carlos," she whispered into the phone, her voice filled with a convincing urgency. "I think he's found out about me. Maybe we should move up the timeline." On the other end, Carlos swore under his breath. That wasn't the plan, Lucy. We can't change everything now. What if he calls the police? What if he decides not to pay the ransom?" Lucy let desperation seep into her voice. "You said you had everything under control, but he's acting like someone who knows more than he should." There was a long pause, during which Lucy could hear Carlos weighing his options. "I'll send Rat and Gordo to check for any suspicious movement around his house. If he's tried to call someone, we'll know." It was exactly the reaction Edward had predicted. Carlos was being forced to split his resources, sending 2 of his men away from the warehouse where Gabriel was being held. With only 1 or 2 guards left, the odds of a successful operation increased significantly. At 11:30, Edward received the confirmation he was waiting for. Rob, watching the warehouse through night vision binoculars, reported over the comms. 2 men just left the location on a motorcycle. That leaves 1 vehicle and, it seems, 1 guard on the perimeter. Edward felt his heart race. Now, Rob confirmed. The approach to the warehouse was tense and methodical. Edward had never been part of anything remotely like a rescue operation, but his experience in high-stakes negotiations had taught him to remain calm under extreme pressure. Every step through the shadows of the industrial district was calculated, every breath controlled. The warehouse was larger than Edward had imagined, with high, dark windows that revealed nothing of the interior. Rob signaled for his men to position themselves at the side entrances, while he and Edward approached the main one. "Remember," Rob whispered, "our priority is Gabriel. If things go sideways, you run with him and don't look back." Through a broken window pane, Edward caught a glimpse of the dimly lit interior. His heart nearly stopped when he saw a small figure huddled in a corner, clutching a teddy bear he recognized immediately. Gabriel was alive, apparently unharmed, but visibly frightened. A large man paced the warehouse floor, speaking softly into a cell phone. He was the guard who had been left to protect Carlos's investment. Edward studied his movements, noting he seemed relaxed, confident in the location's security. "Now I find out what it really means to be a father," Edward murmured to himself, feeling a resolve he had never experienced in any boardroom. Rob gave the signal, and the operation began. The guard never knew what hit him. Rob's men moved with professional efficiency, neutralizing him before he could react or raise an alarm. Within minutes, the warehouse was secure. Edward rushed to Gabriel, who recognized him instantly and reached out his small arms, crying with relief. "Daddy, Daddy!" the child cried, his voice echoing through the empty warehouse. "I'm here, my love. Daddy's here," Edward whispered, hugging his son tightly, feeling tears he didn't know he was shedding wet his face. "You're safe now." But even in that moment of absolute relief, Edward knew the real battle wasn't over. Helen and Carlos were still out there, and revenge was a powerful motivator. The ride home with Gabriel in his arms should have been a moment of absolute triumph, but Edward knew he had kicked a hornet's nest. Carlos would discover the rescue within hours, and his reaction would be violent and unpredictable. Men like him didn't accept defeat without retaliation. "We need to get out of the city, immediately," Rob said, as he drove through the empty pre-dawn streets. Carlos has contacts everywhere. When he finds out he's been played, he'll mobilize every resource to find you and Gabriel." Edward looked at his son, who was asleep in his arms, exhausted by the hours of terror. Gabriel clutched the teddy bear even in his sleep, his small fists clenched as if still fending off nightmares. "What about Lucy?" She held up her end of the bargain. "She's on her way to the airport with fake documents I got through some contacts. In 3 hours, she'll be in another country, far from the reach of both Carlos and the shark." Rob checked the rearview mirror for the 5th time in 2 minutes. "But you have a difficult decision to make." "What decision?" "Helen doesn't know Gabriel has been rescued yet. She'll show up at the exchange tomorrow, expecting to receive $2 million and finalize the custody transfer." Rob paused, choosing his words carefully. "This might be your only chance to confront her directly and end this once and for all." Edward considered his options as he watched the city lights flash by. To run would mean always looking over his shoulder, with no guarantee Helen wouldn't try again. To confront her meant risk, but also the possibility of a definitive resolution. "I want her to pay for what she did," Edward muttered, his voice filled with a cold determination. "I want her to understand the consequences of using our son as a weapon." They arrived at the mansion as the first light of dawn painted the sky a pale pink. Edward carried Gabriel upstairs, gently placing him in his own crib for the first time in days. The child woke for a moment, his big, trusting eyes meeting his father's. "Daddy stay?" Gabriel asked in a sweet voice that melted Edward's heart. "Daddy's staying forever," Edward promised, kissing his son's forehead. No one is ever taking you away from me again." But even as he made that promise, Edward knew Helen would not accept defeat easily. Lucy's phone, which he had kept to monitor communications, began ringing incessantly at 6 in the morning. Carlos had discovered the empty warehouse. "Where is the kid?" Carlos's voice roared through the device when Edward answered, pretending to be Lucy. "The warehouse is empty. My men were found trussed up like pigs." Edward modulated his voice, trying to mimic Lucy's tone. "I don't know anything. I've been here at his house since last night." "Liar! You betrayed me!" Carlos was clearly out of his mind with rage. "I'm going to find you, and when I do, you'll wish you'd never been born." The call cut off abruptly, leaving Edward certain that Carlos was mobilizing all his resources for a desperate hunt. But there was something more unsettling. If Carlos was as surprised as he sounded, it meant Helen didn't know about the rescue either. Edward's phone rang 2 hours later. It was Helen, her voice tense but controlled. "Edward, I trust you're prepared for today's exchange. I have the custody transfer papers ready." "I'll be there," Edward replied, keeping his voice neutral despite the rage boiling inside him. "And Edward, don't try anything clever. Carlos has assured me he has everything under control." There was a coldness in her voice he'd never heard before. "After today, Gabriel will have a better life, away from your neglect." Edward squeezed his free hand until his knuckles turned white. "We'll see." Rob arrived at noon with a detailed plan for the confrontation. "I have men positioned around the depot. If Helen shows up alone, which I believe she will, we can surround her and force a confession. But if Carlos is with her, he'll be desperate and dangerous," Edward finished. "A wounded animal." "Exactly, and wounded animals do unpredictable things." Rob checked his weapon, a gesture that made Edward realize just how far they had come since this all began. "There's still time to change your mind, Ed. We can just hand the evidence over to the police and let them handle it." Edward looked out the window to the garden, where Gabriel was playing under the supervision of a hired security guard. His son was safe, but that wasn't enough. He needed to be sure Helen would never be a threat again. "No," Edward said firmly. "This ends today. It ends with me looking into the eyes of the woman who was willing to destroy her own son's life for revenge." He turned to Rob, his eyes as hard as steel. "Let's go to the meeting." The depot near Pier 47 was a labyrinth of rusted containers and silent cranes, where the smell of sea salt mingled with diesel and decay. Edward arrived promptly at 2, carrying a briefcase that was supposed to contain $2 million, but was actually filled with newspapers cut to the size of banknotes. Helen was already there, leaning against a blue container. Dressed in dark clothes and sunglasses despite the overcast sky, she looked smaller than Edward remembered, more fragile, but there was a tension in her posture that suggested a coiled snake ready to strike. "Punctual as ever," she said as Edward approached, her voice echoing between the metal structures. "Where's the money?" Edward held up the briefcase. "Where's Gabriel?" "He'll be here in a few minutes. Carlos is bringing him." Helen took off her glasses, revealing eyes Edward barely recognized, cold, calculating, void of the warmth that had once drawn him in. "I hope you've learned something from all this, Edward." "I've learned a lot," Edward answered, keeping his voice calm despite the hatred simmering in his veins. "I've learned I never really knew my son's mother." Helen laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the empty containers. "You never knew me, Edward, our entire marriage. You only saw what you wanted to see, the perfect wife, the dedicated mother, the decorative piece at your business functions. And that justifies kidnapping our own son. It justifies taking back what's mine." Helen's mask of control slipped for a moment, revealing the rage consuming her. "You took Gabriel from me with money and expensive lawyers. I just used the resources available to me." Edward took a step forward, studying the face of the woman he had once loved, resources that included armed criminals and death threats. "Carlos was more extreme than I expected," Helen admitted, but her voice carried no real remorse. "But it worked. You're here, with the money, ready to sign the papers that will give me custody of Gabriel." "And where are these papers?" Helen gestured to a leather portfolio leaning against the container behind her. "All legal, prepared by competent attorneys. You sign, transfer the money, and Gabriel and I disappear from your life forever." "Forever," Edward repeated, savoring the words. "You mean you plan to take my son to another country, where I'll never see him again? Gabriel will be happy with me, away from your obsession with work, away from the emotional neglect you call fatherhood." Helen pushed off the container, circling Edward like a predator sizing up its prey. "He'll grow up knowing he's loved, not just a convenient prop for a family photo." Edward felt each word like a blade, mostly because there was truth in so many of them. He had been an absent father, obsessed with financial success at the expense of emotional presence. But that didn't justify the terror Gabriel had been put through. "And if I refuse?" Edward asked. "Then Carlos will execute Plan B," Helen answered with a coldness that made Edward's blood run cold. "And you'll find out there are things worse than losing custody of a child." It was in that moment that Edward knew for sure. She had no idea that Gabriel had been rescued, that Carlos had been duped, that the entire plan had crumbled overnight. She was standing there believing she was still in control. "Helen," Edward said softly, "there's something you need to know. The only thing I need to know is whether you're going to sign these papers or not." Edward opened the briefcase, revealing the cut newspapers. Helen stared at the contents with growing confusion, then looked up at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning panic. "Gabriel is at home," Edward said calmly. "Safe, protected, playing in the garden where he belongs. Your plan failed." Helen's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Impossible. Carlos assured me. Carlos was played. His men were captured. And now you're here, alone, with no hostage, no leverage, just a woman who conspired to kidnap her own son." Helen backed away, her hand instinctively going to the purse she carried. "You don't understand. I did it for love. Gabriel deserves a mother who is present. Gabriel deserves parents who don't use him as a weapon in their personal wars," Edward retorted, taking another step toward her. "And now you're going to pay for every moment of terror you caused an innocent child." It was then they heard the sound of tires screeching on asphalt, and a familiar van appeared between the containers, driving at a dangerous speed directly toward them. Carlos leaped from the van in an animalistic fury, his face contorted by rage and humiliation. In his hand, he held a gun, which he aimed directly at Edward while screaming profanities that echoed through the port. "You thought you were smart, didn't you?" Carlos advanced, his voice hoarse with hatred. "Thought you could play me, steal my merchandise, and just walk away." Helen shrank back, clearly terrified by the raw violence emanating from Carlos. "Calm down. Carlos, we can work this out. Edward has plenty of money. We can—" "Shut up!" Carlos briefly turned the gun on Helen. "You and your idiot ex-husband ruined everything. Now I have to improvise. And when I improvise, people die." Edward kept his hands visible, his eyes scanning for Rob's men who were supposed to be positioned around the depot. Where were they? The plan was to intercept Helen, not to deal with an armed and unhinged Carlos. "Carlos, you can still walk away from this," Edward said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Drop the gun, disappear, and no one gets hurt." "No one gets hurt," Carlos laughed hysterically. "I'm out 300 grand that I paid that backstabbing bitch Lucy. I lost the kid who was my collateral. And now my reputation is shot because some slick-suited businessman made a fool out of me." It was then Edward realized the terrifying truth. Carlos wasn't just here for financial revenge. He was here to reclaim his reputation in the criminal underworld, and that meant he had to prove that no one could cross him and get away with it. "You're going to give me 2 million for my trouble," Carlos continued, "and then I'm going to kill you and your ex-wife to set an example. No loose ends." Helen turned completely pale. "Wait, Carlos, I hired you. We're partners. You were useful when you had a working plan. Now you're just a liability." Carlos aimed the gun back at Edward. "Call your bank. Wire 2 million to the account I'm about to give you. Now." Edward pretended to reach for his phone, but he was actually activating a device Rob had given him, an emergency beacon that would alert the positioned men. "The banks are closed. It's Saturday." "Liar." Carlos was visibly losing control. "Online banking, the app, something." "I can try," Edward said, buying time while praying Rob had received the signal. It was Helen who broke the tension, making one last desperate plea. "Edward, you don't understand. I did all of this for Gabriel. He needs a mother who is present." "Present?" Edward stared at her in disbelief. "You traumatized our son, Helen. He spent hours terrified, not understanding why he wasn't home. How is that being a present mother? I was going to explain everything once we were away. He would have understood that I saved him from a life of neglect." "You didn't save anyone," Edward retorted, his voice filled with a profound sadness. "You destroyed any chance we had of a civil relationship for Gabriel's sake. You chose revenge over love." Carlos cut off the argument with a sharp gesture of his gun. "Enough talk. 2 dead bodies will solve all my problems." But before he could pull the trigger, sirens blared through the port, and police cars swarmed in from all directions. Rob had kept his promise of having a backup plan. Carlos looked around in a panic, realizing he was surrounded. For a terrifying moment, Edward thought he would open fire anyway, turning the capture into a bloodbath. But the sight of so many armed officers finally broke his bravado. "Not worth it," Carlos muttered, dropping the gun to the ground. "Life in prison isn't worth 2 million. As Carlos was cuffed and placed in a squad car, Helen stood in silence, watching her world completely fall apart. When the police finally approached her, her last words were directed at Edward. "You'll never love him the way I do," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Gabriel deserved a better mother. Gabriel deserved better parents," Edward replied softly. "And now, at least, he'll have a father who has learned what truly matters." Rob appeared at Edward's side as the squad cars pulled away. "It's over," he said simply. Edward looked up at the sky, where dark clouds were finally breaking to reveal rays of sun. "No," he said, thinking of the son waiting for him at home. "Today it's just beginning." The 6-year-old girl who had saved everything with her courage came to his mind, and Edward knew exactly what his first act as the new man he had become would be. 6 months later, Central Park had become a completely different place for Edward, no longer a backdrop for neglect and danger, but a symbol of second chances and vigilant love. He sat on the same bench where it all began, watching Gabriel play in the sandbox with the absolute concentration typical of a 2-year-old. But Gabriel wasn't alone. A girl with neatly combed hair and clean clothes was helping him build castles, patiently teaching him how to pack the damp sand. Her eyes were the same ones that had shone with courage and determination on that fateful afternoon, but now they reflected safety and happiness. "Sophia, watch that Gabriel doesn't put sand in his mouth," Edward said softly, his voice full of the affection he had learned to express. "I've got it, Dad," Sophia replied, naturally using the word that still made Edward's heart skip a beat. "I'll take care of him." The adoption process had been complex, but Edward had discovered that money, when applied to just causes, could move bureaucratic mountains. Sophia had undergone full medical exams, therapy to deal with the trauma of living on the streets, and was now attending a private school where she quickly excelled with her sharp intelligence. "Mr. Miles," a familiar voice made him turn. It was Lucy, but a completely transformed version of the woman who had conspired against his family. Her hair was shorter, her face showed signs of inner peace, and she was holding the hand of a small child. "Lucy." Edward stood, extending a hand in a cordial greeting. "How are you?" "Good." "Very good." She smiled genuinely for the first time since Edward had met her. "I got a job at a preschool in Portland. Ironic, isn't it? Now I'm taking care of kids for real, protecting them instead of putting them in danger." The child beside her, a boy of about 4, watched Gabriel and Sophia with shy curiosity. "This is Matthew," Lucy explained. "My nephew. I've been taking care of him since my sister, since she couldn't anymore." Edward nodded, understanding without needing details. "Would you like them to play together? Matthew would love some new friends." As the children played under watchful eyes, Edward and Lucy talked about change and redemption. She had used the money Edward had paid her as agreed to settle her debts and start over in another state, far from the temptations and threats that had nearly destroyed her life. "How are Helen and Carlos?" Lucy asked hesitantly. Helen got 8 years for kidnapping and criminal conspiracy. Carlos got 15 for the same crimes, plus illegal possession of a firearm. Edward watched Gabriel laugh as Sophia tickled him. It's enough time for Gabriel to grow up without her toxic influence. "And you, how are you handling everything?" Edward considered the question carefully. The last few months had been a complete revolution in his life. He had sold 2 of his companies, keeping only the most stable ones, and drastically reduced his workload. He was now home every day by 5, had dinner with the kids, read bedtime stories, and never answered a business call after 7 p.m. "I discovered that being truly rich has nothing to do with money," Edward answered. "It's about having time for the people you love." Sophia ran up to him just then, holding a yellow flower she had picked. "For you, Dad, because you saved our family." Edward took the flower, his hands trembling slightly with emotion. "No, sweetheart, you saved our family. Your courage saved Gabriel and taught me what it really means to be a father." Sophia smiled and ran back to play with the boys, leaving Edward to reflect on the events that had transformed his life. The brave girl who had whispered terrifying words in this very park had become his daughter. The person who had taught him that family isn't just determined by blood, but by love, protection, and presence. "There's one thing I've always wanted to ask," Lucy said. "How did Sophia know about the orange pajamas?" Edward smiled, watching his adopted daughter teach Gabriel how to make sand cakes. "She told me the truth a few weeks after the adoption. She saw Marissa photographing Gabriel in the alley, but she didn't understand what was happening until she saw me with him in the park. That's when she realized Gabriel was in danger and decided to warn me. A 6-year-old connecting dots that adults couldn't." The streets teach observation and survival in ways we privileged folks never have to learn. Edward stood up, checking the time. It's time for the kids. Snack. Sophia insists on a strict routine for Gabriel. As they walked toward the car, Edward paused for a moment to look at the park one last time that afternoon. The place where he had nearly lost everything had become the symbol of his redemption as a father and as a human being. Sometimes, Edward said to Lucy, the smallest voices carry the most important warnings. And sometimes, saving someone else is how you save yourself. Gabriel slept peacefully in the back seat while Sophia hummed softly. And Edward drove home knowing he had found true wealth, a family built on love, protection, and the presence that matters more than any material fortune.